Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to talk to you and give you my final verdict, my final review on Sigma's new 100 to 400 millimeter. This is an f5 to 6.3, and this is from their contemporary line. It has their optical stabilizer, image stabilization, and of course it is designed for both full frame and APS-C cameras. Now, I will be giving you a separate, more detailed coverage on APS-C, and I'll just quickly allude to that here today. But mostly I'm here to give you coverage on full frame in this review here to follow up on the sequence of the series that I have been doing covering this lens to this point. Now, if you missed my closer look, detailed look at the build quality and the design, the feature specs of this list, I would recommend you take a look at my first look review and breakdown of the overall handling of the lens there. But there is one addition that I want to make to that I kind of discovered after the fact. I alluded in that segment to how I wasn't crazy about the design of the lens hood here. I felt it was just a little bit of an awkward profile. But I discovered that that actually has an intentional purpose. It's designed that way, and so your fingers fit into that groove very easily to allow you to use the lens in a push-pull type design. Which, of course, when I discovered that, and thanks to my friend in Sigma Canada that let me know about that, it made a huge difference because I could understand the reason for it. And used in that way, it actually works very well, allowing those of you that prefer a push-pull type zoom design as opposed to the typical twist zoom. I was actually really pleasantly surprised with the build quality of the lens itself. It exceeded my expectations, and as I've used it for the last 3 weeks, that's continued to be my observations, that while it is not, top tier, it's not built like a tank like my Canon 100 to 400L Mark II is, but at the same time it's designed very well. Everything works as it should, and so I'm very quite pleased with it overall. The one thing I will note is that zoom lock, it will only work at the 100 millimeter position, and unfortunately its positioning here in the center of the lens, basically the only place that's not occupied with other things, means that not only does the lens not come with a tripod collar and foot, but there's not really any place to fit one even for an aftermarket type design, really because of that zoom lock right there. That this is a handhold only type lens. Now, for everyday shooting, it's light enough that I don't think that's a big deal. But I will say that if you want to use it from a tripod, and of course I had to use it that way for some of my standardized testing, it definitely wants to droop down, and so it can be kind of hard to frame things properly with your tripod if you're trying to set up like that. So that is the one, I would say, misstep with this design, and I think that Sigma probably crunched the numbers and decided that most people will be using this lens handheld anyway, and so I think that they're probably correct in that, but I know that this will also alienate a few of you who prefer to use a lens like this on a tripod for whatever function you're using it. And in doing so, of course, it's at a serious disadvantage without having a tripod collar and foot attached. Now, the good news is that I discovered when shooting with this lens and comparing it to my excellent Canon 100 to 400L Mark II, that the actual image quality exceeded my expectations. And if you haven't seen that segment, it's quite revealing, and I would encourage you to take a look at that episode here. My discovery in that is that at a number of different focal lengths, the Sigma was actually the sharper lens from the two. Now note that it does operate at a disadvantage in terms of aperture across its focus, its whole focal range. It technically starts at f5, but just note that it will move to f5.6 in less than 10 millimeters from that 100 millimeter position. And of course, it quite quickly at a little over 200 millimeters, around 223, I believe, millimeters, it will jump on to f6.3, where it is for the rest of the range. And so compared to the Canon starts at f4.5 and ends at f5.6, and at all focal values along the way, the Canon will let in a fair bit more light. The Sigma also has a far more pronounced vignette, but As far as the disadvantages of this lens, they basically end there. It is just as sharp at almost all focal lengths, and in some cases sharper than the Canon, and that's particularly obvious out towards the periphery of the frame. At 100 millimeters, even wide open, this lens is sharp from corner to corner in a way that the Canon just can't compete with. It also has excellent contrast wide open. I really like the color rendering out of the lens, and so the advantage here is that while it has a slow maximum aperture, the good news is you don't have to stop it down to get great image quality out of it. At all focal lengths, I feel like you can shoot wide open and get results that you're going to be happy with. So that does help a bit to offset the limitations of that maximum aperture disadvantage. And of course, part of that is that it also has a 67 millimeter front filter, and that's pretty small when you consider, for example, that Sigma's 150 to 600 millimeter contemporary lens has a front filter thread of 95 millimeters. And Sigma optimized this to make it as small as they possibly could while simultaneously giving you great image quality. And I have to say, mission accomplished as far as that. But just note that this is going to be a lens that is going to prefer a good amount of light. Now, on that note, the optical stabilizer does a good job. Now, I actually was surprised when I did a head-to-head comparison with my Canon lens. I anticipated, because of how I felt like the lens performed in the field, and that was mostly based on the performance and how it stabilized the viewfinder, which, you know, frankly, it doesn't do as good a job as what my Canon regard. But when I compared them head to head, I found that the Canon had just a couple more keepers at, you know, very extreme shutter speeds, and so I ran the test at 1/25th of a second, I ran a test at 1/15th of a second, 1/10th, and then even all the way down to 1/6. And while most of the ones at 1/6 are throwaways, I did get a keeper or two along in there. So in extreme situations with a very still target, you know, you fire off a few frames even at extreme, ridiculously low shutter speeds, and the optical stabilizer did allow me to get some keepers. And so it really was fairly close to the Canon. They behave a little bit differently, and frankly, I do prefer the behavior of the Canon. Not that this jumps in the viewfinder, but in composing at longer focal lengths, it's easier when you have a more stabilized viewfinder image. Do note, however, that through the USB dock into one of the custom modes, you can program in some changes to the behavior of the OS and try to get a more stabilized viewfinder. However, you can do that also with the autofocus, and I'll get to that in just a second. But I will also tell you that after I set some of those custom modes into the lens and then tried them, I went back and forth, and at least in limited testing, I didn't find much of a difference even after programming in that. Your mileage may vary when it comes to that, but for myself, at least in the limited amount of testing, I didn't notice a big difference from programming in customized behavior. But it's great to have those options, and of course having those custom modes on the lens is one of the ways where I think it really punches above its price point. Now, when it comes to autofocus, this is the one thing that I have been kind of warning people that I'm going to get to at the end, because some of you, when you saw the image quality results, you were ready to, you know, some of you even thinking about selling your far more expensive Canon or Nikon equivalent. Just wait for this first, because for many ways of shooting, this lens does just fine. And certainly in single shot mode, it did everything that I wanted to do. And the great news is once I calibrated it in using the USB dock and I calibrated it for different focus distances, it was extremely accurate for me. In fact, it was no less accurate than what my Canon lens was and used in those kinds of situations. And so again, big kudos to Sigma that this particular lens, I was able to dial in autofocus and get very accurate results both on full frame and APS-C. So consider me delighted on that result. Autofocus speed in one-shot mode is fine for almost everything. I did find it took a little longer than what I would like to rack the full range of focus. So if you go from somewhere near minimum focus distance to infinity, it takes a little longer than what I would like, but it does have a focal limiter here that I recommend using. And so when you're in situations where you're not going to need to shoot right up close, just go ahead and click that. That will allow you to just shoot from 6 meters to infinity, and you'll find that you don't have to worry. Even if you miss focus, it's not going to do that big kind of slow focus rack. Now, things are not quite so rosy when I tested it in AF servo mode. And so we're going to take a moment and just kind of take a look at this interactively together and kind of show you firsthand some of the difference in the comparison results that I got. For most shooting, it was fast enough. And the fact is, we're going to see with these images, if you're kind of shooting more of a panning or a lateral type movement, autofocus had no problem under those circumstances. It's fast enough, and you're not radically changing the plane of focus. And so, these are, they're not, as you can see, it's not perfectly focused, but it is acceptably focused. And there's always a factor here that there is some motion blur that's a part of the equation. It's at 1/500th of a second, which is enough obviously to freeze the dust here. I would say focus in this shot here has lagged just a little bit behind the movement. We see the same to be true here in the second frame, that it hasn't really adjusted forward quickly enough. This is an AF servo mode on a Canon 5D Mark IV, and so we can see focus has still kind of remained behind in this shot. But all of these are at the same time, I think, acceptably focused to where, it still produces a result that, you can be quite happy with. Now, scenario changes, however, if the object or the subject is moving towards you. And so, for example, in this frame here, or this sequence, we can see that the autofocus is lagging behind. And so once again, this is AF servo, and I'm using the center portion here. And so we're certainly within the right framework of where it should be focusing. But as you can see, it's just not locking onto and keeping up with the subject. And focus has moved forward hardly at all here. So just to give you a comparison point, here's a similar sequence that is shot with the Canon 100-400L Mark II. And so as we go through this particular sequence, and this is, I think, around 17 frames over a little less than 3 seconds. And so the, the subject here, the dog, is moving quickly forward, running forward, but as you can see, the little boy trying to keep up is further and further out of focus. But for the dog, we're keeping everything in acceptable focus here, even as the dog starts to get quite close to the camera itself. And so we can see that even towards the very end of that frame, that sequence, that we still have a good focus here, and focus is not lagging behind. At this point, depth of field is quite small, so the fact that we're still in focus where it should be is very promising. And here another sequence with the Canon, and so here we can see that the actual movement is kind of going across the plane, not a straight line. And so as I'm moving over to try to keep up with the movement, as the dog is kind of moving some laterally while moving forward, you can see that we lost it a little bit here for these final shots, but we're also getting very close to the minimum focus distance, and so that becomes an issue here. Now here, if we switch back to the Sigma, and let me just say before I move on that I actually prefer the rendering from the Sigma, which shocks me to say, but just look at these images shot back to back a few minutes apart. I actually really like the look from the Sigma. I like the color rendition. I like the contrast out of the box. But as we're going to see in another similar type sequence, that the autofocus is just, it's not the same when it comes to tracking. And as you can see, once again, we have lost the subject, and lost pretty bad now. And I would find that sometimes once it kind of lost tracking, that it couldn't, let me go back here for a second, it wouldn't even pick back up. And so if you're wanting to do top tier, sports or wildlife, bird in flight, as great as the optics are on this lens, I don't know that you're going to be satisfied with the autofocus performance in terms of speed and keeping up in tracking. Now, for action shots where you're not really rapidly changing the kind of the plane of field, it's not a problem. I mean, look at these type shots. No problem. I mean, and here I'm kind of tracking up. The camera's doing a great job kind of following, or the lens doing a great job following the movement, you know, as the animal begins to move. But that's different than tracking it, you know, particularly when it's moving towards you and you have the plane of focus that is rapidly moving forward. So even with a very, very good autofocus system like the 5D Mark IVs, the Sigma 100 to 400 millimeter contemporary lens, it just can't really keep up in my experience when it comes to actual tracking. And so as you can see, unfortunately, AF servo tracking performance isn't really on par with the Canon lens, and I suspect it's probably not going to be on par with either the Nikon or the Sony lens either. These lenses, of course, cost, in some cases, 3 times as much. And so, you know, perhaps you shouldn't expect the AF system to be top tier compared to those. That being said, of course, this is kind of the line in the sand for you. It depends on what you're going to want to do with this lens. If you're going to use it as a more casual shooter to where it covers that focal length and you'll cover some action, but not necessarily extremely fast moving action, I think the AF system is going to work just fine for you. But just note that if you are a bird in flight shooter, you're going to shoot faster action sports, or if you're going to, you know, anything else where you need to track higher speed, I think that you may need to continue to, you know, pop those pennies in the penny jar and save your money for one of the first party lenses. That's the one area where it really can't quite keep up with them. And also recognize that because it has a pretty slow maximum aperture, in dim light, you're going to find some situations where the AF system gets bulky and just doesn't want to lock focus. And that has as much to do with the diminished amount of light reaching the sensor as it does, you know, with the autofocus system itself. But just note that that may be the one area that you're let down. Not by autofocus, you know, consistency or accuracy. Both of those things are actually excellent. But where it's not so excellent is when it comes to dealing with the more challenging focus conditions, either tracking or low light type conditions. But I think that most shooters shooting most things will find the lens autofocus adequate to what they're trying to do. At under $800 coming into the US market, competing with lenses that are all $2,000 plus, I think that Sigma has done a knock it out of the park job with this particular lens. The 100 millimeter to 400 millimeter f5 to 6.3 DG OS HSM contemporary lens is really pretty fantastic. And I think that it is a very valid option to consider if you're cross-shopping a 70 to 300 millimeter lens, or even if you're considering a 150 to 600 millimeter lens. And so if you're on a budget and you would like to cover this focal length, take a long look at the Sigma 100 to 400 Contemporary. It really is a great bang for the buck lens. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you look in the description down below, you can find links to the image gallery, links to my full written review with lots of samples there. And of course, you can also find buying links from B&H Photo, Amazon, and other places. And of course, every time that you click on those links and you purchase, you help to fund this channel and to keep it going. And have a great day.